Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the dust, discipline, and occasional misery of life inside the army of the Roman Empire. Specifically, the life of a Roman legionary. One of the thousands of soldiers who marched, sweated, and occasionally complained their way across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East while Rome quietly collected territories like souvenirs. Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel across the world while we all collectively try to fall asleep. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that gentle background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey. You wake up before the sun. Not because you want to. Not because you're feeling especially motivated about conquering Gaul today. You wake up because a man with a stick is shouting at everyone. This is the Optio, the assistant officer of your century, and he is already in a terrible mood. Your bed, if we're being generous with the word bed, is a rolled blanket on hard ground inside a leather tent shared with 7 other soldiers. Roman military organization believes deeply in teamwork, especially when it comes to sharing discomfort. The air smells like damp leather, smoke from last night's fire, and 8 men who have been wearing the same wool tunic for longer than polite society would approve. You sit up slowly. Your back hurts. Your shoulders hurt. Your feet hurt. Actually, everything hurts. Welcome to life in a Roman legion. Outside the tent, the camp is already alive. Thousands of soldiers are stirring, coughing, stretching, and muttering the universal language of men who have been awake far too early. Somewhere nearby, a mule brays in protest. Mules are the real heroes of the Roman army. They carry tents, tools, weapons, cooking gear, and occasionally the emotional baggage of the soldiers who rely on them. Your mule, if you're lucky enough to have one nearby, is currently staring at you with the quiet judgment of a creature that knows it will once again be hauling your entire life across several miles of dirt road. You step into your sandals. Roman military sandals, called calligi, are sturdy leather footwear reinforced with iron hobnails. They're excellent for marching. They're terrible for comfort. But comfort is not part of the Roman military budget. Breakfast is quick. Very quick. Because breakfast is mostly bread. Hard bread. Bread that has clearly been in storage long enough to develop a personality. You soften it in water or wine if you're lucky. If you're unlucky, you chew it dry and pretend your teeth are stronger than they actually are. Sometimes there's porridge. Sometimes a bit of cheese. Occasionally salted meat. Mostly bread. Roman soldiers eat a lot of bread. Historians often say the Roman Empire ran on discipline, engineering, and military organization. It also ran on bread. An astonishing amount of bread. The sun finally begins to rise. Golden light spreads across the camp, revealing neat rows of tents arranged with almost obsessive precision. Roman camps are famous for their order. Even when the army stops for a single night, they build a full fortified camp. Every time. No exceptions. Which means yesterday evening, after marching 20 miles, you and thousands of other soldiers spent several hours digging ditches and building walls. Because the Roman army believes in 2 things above all else. Preparation. And making sure soldiers are too tired to cause trouble. Your equipment waits beside you. And it is not light. A Roman legionary carries roughly 60 to 100 pounds of gear depending on the campaign. Your shield. Your sword. Your javelins. Your armor. Your tools. Your cooking equipment. Your spare clothing. Your personal belongings. Plus whatever random items your centurion decides you should probably carry. Roman soldiers are sometimes called Marius's mules. This nickname comes from the reforms of the general Gaius Marius, who believed soldiers should carry more of their own equipment. Which is a polite historical way of saying he decided mules shouldn't have all the fun. You strap on your armor. Chainmail if you're lucky. Segmented plate armor if you're particularly well equipped. Either way, it's heavy. It clinks when you move. And it becomes incredibly warm once the sun climbs higher in the sky. Your helmet goes on next. Roman helmets are practical, sturdy, and not especially comfortable. But they do an excellent job of preventing sudden headaches caused by enemy swords. Now comes training. Roman soldiers train constantly. Even when there is no war. Especially when there is no war. Training keeps soldiers sharp. It also keeps them too exhausted to complain about the bread. You practice sword strikes against wooden posts. These posts represent enemies. They do not complain. They also do not fight back, which makes them extremely popular training partners. The wooden practice swords are heavier than real swords. Because Roman training philosophy is simple. If practice is harder than battle, battle feels easier. By mid-morning, sweat is already soaking through your tunic. The sun climbs higher. The dust rises from hundreds of marching feet. Orders are shouted. Shields lock together. Javelins are thrown again and again. Somewhere nearby, a centurion is yelling at a recruit who has somehow managed to hold his shield upside down. This happens more often than you'd expect. Life in the Roman army is not glamorous. It's repetitive. Structured. Disciplined. You march. You train. You build camps. You march again. Then occasionally, when diplomacy fails and someone insults Rome badly enough, you fight. And fighting, when it finally happens, is terrifying. Because the enemy across the field is not a training post. He has a sword. He has friends with swords. And he is very motivated not to become part of the Roman Empire today. But that part of the story comes later. For now, the sun continues to rise. The march is about to begin. And you, proud soldier of Rome, are about to walk 20 miles wearing enough metal to build a small statue. All before lunch. The order to march comes shortly after sunrise. Not with a trumpet blast or a dramatic speech. Just a centurion shouting something that roughly translates to, move. You stand in formation with the rest of your century. Around 80 men arranged in disciplined lines, each one carrying enough equipment to start a small traveling hardware store. Your shield rests against your shoulder. Your pack presses into your back. Your helmet feels slightly too tight. And somewhere behind you, a mule is making the kind of noise that suggests it regrets all of its life choices. The Roman army begins to move. Not in a chaotic rush. But in a slow, steady rhythm. Thousands of boots striking the earth in a pattern so regular it almost becomes hypnotic. Step. 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 The road stretches ahead of you. And it will keep stretching for hours. Roman soldiers march a lot. Historians estimate a typical legion could travel around 20 miles in a single day while fully equipped. 20 miles. Which sounds impressive until you remember you're doing it while wearing armor and carrying what feels like half the contents of a blacksmith's shop. The Romans actually had two different kinds of marches. A regular march and a forced march. The regular march is about 20 miles. The forced march is closer to 30. No one likes forced marches. Except perhaps the officers who ordered them. The landscape slowly changes as you move. Rolling hills. Dusty plains. Occasional forests. Sometimes farmland. Sometimes villages that become very quiet when they see several thousand Roman soldiers walking toward them. People tend to become extremely polite when an army shows up outside their town. It's a natural survival instinct. Your pack digs into your shoulders. The Roman army expects soldiers to carry their own gear whenever possible. That includes tools. Because soldiers aren't just fighters. They're builders. Engineers. Laborers. And occasionally amateur road construction crews. You carry a shovel. Or a pickaxe. Or a wooden stake used to build camp defenses. Which means that after marching all day, you'll also spend the evening digging. Rome believes in efficiency. And apparently also believes soldiers have unlimited energy. Hours pass. The sun climbs higher. Your tunic sticks to your back with sweat. Dust coats your sandals. Somewhere ahead in the column, an officer calls for a brief rest. The army pauses. Not for long. Just enough time to drink water and adjust your gear. Roman discipline does not encourage long breaks. If you sit too comfortably, someone will probably tell you to stand again. The march continues. Step. 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 After a while, the rhythm becomes strangely calming. There's something almost peaceful about moving forward with thousands of other people who are all just as tired as you are. No one talks much. Talking wastes breath. And besides, most soldiers are saving their energy for complaining later. Eventually the army stops. Not because you've reached a city. Not because you've reached a battlefield. But because the officers have decided this is where you'll spend the night. Which means it's time to build another camp. Roman camps are famous for their organization. Every single camp is built in roughly the same layout. Even if the army only plans to stay for one night. Which means the moment you arrive, you start digging. First comes the ditch. A wide trench dug around the perimeter of the camp. Then the dirt from that trench is piled inward to form a rampart. Then wooden stakes are placed on top. Together they create a defensive wall. All of this is done by soldiers who just finished marching 20 miles. Which sounds impressive until you remember you're doing it while wearing armor and carrying what feels like half the contents of a blacksmith's shop. The Romans actually had two different kinds of marches. A regular march and a forced march. The regular march is about 20 miles. The forced march is closer to 30. No one likes forced marches. Except perhaps the officers who ordered them. The landscape slowly changes as you move. Rolling hills. Dusty plains. Occasional forests. Sometimes farmland. Sometimes villages that become very quiet when they see several thousand Roman soldiers walking toward them. People tend to become extremely polite when an army shows up outside their town. It's a natural survival instinct. Your pack digs into your shoulders. The Roman army expects soldiers to carry their own gear whenever possible. That includes tools. Because soldiers aren't just fighters. They're builders. Engineers. Laborers. And occasionally amateur road construction crews. You carry a shovel. Or a pickaxe. Or a wooden stake used to build camp defenses. Which means that after marching all day, you'll also spend the evening digging. Rome believes in efficiency. And apparently also believes soldiers have unlimited energy. Hours pass. The sun climbs higher. Your tunic sticks to your back with sweat. Dust coats your sandals. Somewhere ahead in the column, an officer calls for a brief rest. The army pauses. Not for long. Just enough time to drink water and adjust your gear. Roman discipline does not encourage long breaks. If you sit too comfortably, someone will probably tell you to stand again. The march continues. Step. 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 After a while, the rhythm becomes strangely calming. There's something almost peaceful about moving forward with thousands of other people who are all just as tired as you are. No one talks much. Talking wastes breath. And besides, most soldiers are saving their energy for complaining later. Eventually the army stops. Not because you've reached a city. Not because you've reached a battlefield. But because the officers have decided this is where you'll spend the night. Which means it's time to build another camp. Roman camps are famous for their organization. Every single camp is built in roughly the same layout. Even if the army only plans to stay for one night. Which means the moment you arrive, you start digging. First comes the ditch. A wide trench dug around the perimeter of the camp. Then the dirt from that trench is piled inward to form a rampart. Then wooden stakes are placed on top. Together they create a defensive wall. All of this is done by soldiers who just finished marching 20 miles. If you were hoping for a relaxing evening, you joined the wrong army. Inside the camp, the layout is precise. Streets are arranged in straight lines. Tents are placed in neat rows. Command tents sit near the center. Supply areas are carefully organized. The result looks less like a temporary camp and more like a small city that appeared in a single afternoon. Which is exactly the point. Roman camps are designed so that even if the army is attacked at night, everyone knows exactly where they need to go. Order saves lives. Chaos loses battles. Once the camp is finished, soldiers can finally rest. Sort of. Because there are still chores. Equipment must be cleaned. Weapons must be checked. Armor must be repaired. Food must be prepared. Roman soldiers cook their own meals most of the time. Which means dinner depends heavily on whatever supplies the army has managed to bring along. Grain is the most common ingredient. Grain is boiled into porridge. Or ground into flour and baked into rough bread. Sometimes there's meat. Usually salted. Occasionally fresh if someone managed to hunt something during the march. You sit with the other men in your tent group. 8 soldiers sharing food around a small fire. The conversation is quiet. Mostly tired jokes. Stories from previous campaigns. Complaints about officers. Soldiers across history have always shared 2 favorite topics. Food. And complaining about authority figures. Somewhere nearby, a group of soldiers is laughing about a recruit who tripped during training earlier that day. Another group is arguing about whether the wine ration should be larger. Someone is attempting to repair a broken sandal with a piece of leather and an optimistic amount of hope. The camp slowly settles into evening. But not everyone sleeps. Roman camps maintain strict guard rotations. Some soldiers stand watch at the gates. Others patrol the walls. The Roman army takes nighttime security very seriously. Because an enemy attack in the dark can destroy an unprepared army. Which is exactly why Roman camps are so heavily fortified. You eventually crawl into your tent. Your blanket feels surprisingly comfortable after a day like this. Your muscles ache. Your shoulders feel bruised. Your feet feel like they've walked across half the known world. And in some campaigns, they eventually will. Tomorrow will be the same. Another early wake-up. Another long march. Another camp to build. Maybe a battle. Maybe another road. Maybe another village watching nervously from behind its gates. Life in the army of the Roman Empire is not glamorous. But it is relentless. And that relentless discipline is exactly how Rome built an empire stretching across continents. Eventually sleep takes you. The camp grows quiet. The fires burn low. Somewhere along the walls, a guard walks slowly beneath the stars. And beyond those walls, in forests, hills, and distant villages, there are enemies who would very much prefer the Roman army never wake up tomorrow. Unfortunately for them, Rome wakes up early. Morning comes again far too quickly. It always does in a Roman camp. The sky is still gray when the first horn sounds somewhere near the center of camp. It's not loud enough to feel dramatic. It's just loud enough to remind everyone that the army of Rome has absolutely no interest in letting you sleep in. You open your eyes. For a moment you forget where you are. Then your back reminds you. The ground beneath your blanket feels exactly like the ground. Hard, uneven, and not particularly interested in your comfort. Around you, the other men in your tent are already waking. Someone coughs. Someone else groans quietly like a man who just remembered he has to march another 20 miles today. Outside, the camp is stirring again. Thousands of soldiers rising in near-perfect routine. Because the Roman army runs on routine the way a mill runs on water. Without it, nothing works. You step outside the tent. The air is cold and sharp. Morning mist clings to the ground, drifting slowly between rows of tents and supply wagons. Somewhere nearby, a soldier is already tending a small fire for breakfast. Breakfast, once again, is simple. Grain porridge. Bread. Maybe a little cheese if someone traded well yesterday. Roman soldiers don't expect luxury. They expect food that keeps them walking. And for the most part, that's exactly what they get. As the sun rises, the camp slowly transforms from a quiet resting place into a machine preparing for movement. Armor is strapped on. Sandals are tightened. Weapons are inspected. You check your sword. The gladius, the standard Roman short sword. It's not especially long. But it doesn't need to be. Roman soldiers are trained to stab rather than swing. A quick thrust behind the shield. Fast. Efficient. Deadly. Nearby you pick up your shield, the scutum. Large, curved, and built like a portable wall. When hundreds of soldiers lock these shields together, they form something that looks less like a group of men and more like a moving fortress. Rome doesn't win battles with flashy heroics. Rome wins with organization. Once the equipment is checked, the training begins again. Even on campaign. Especially on campaign. Roman officers believe that soldiers who stop training start dying. So the drills continue. Shield formations. Marching drills. Javelin throwing. The Roman javelin, called a pilum, is designed in a clever way. When it strikes a shield, the thin metal shank bends. That means the enemy can't easily pull it out. And suddenly their shield becomes heavy, awkward, and much less useful. Sometimes the enemy simply throws the shield away. Which is exactly what Roman soldiers were hoping for. Nearby, a centurion walks along the training lines. Centurions are the backbone of the Roman army. They command about 80 men and have the authority to make your day either manageable or miserable. Most centurions earn their rank through experience. Which means they have seen years of marches, battles, and very foolish recruits. They expect discipline. They expect effort. And they are not shy about correcting mistakes. Usually loudly. And occasionally with a stick. After the drills come inspections. Armor must be clean. Weapons must be sharp. Gear must be properly packed. If something looks sloppy, the centurion will notice. And when a centurion notices something, everyone nearby suddenly becomes very interested in looking busy. By mid-morning, the army is ready to move again. Orders pass quietly down the lines. Tents are dismantled. Tools are packed. Supply wagons creak into position. And slowly, like some enormous metal creature waking up, the Roman army begins another march. The road today winds through forests. Tall trees stretch overhead, their branches forming a shifting pattern of shadow and sunlight across the path. Birds scatter as thousands of soldiers pass beneath them. Somewhere in these forests there may be enemies watching. Tribes who know the land far better than the soldiers marching through it. Men who understand every hill, every river crossing, every hidden path. This is exactly the kind of terrain where Roman discipline is tested. And sometimes, where it fails, the soldiers remember stories. Stories whispered during long marches and quiet nights. Stories about the disaster in the forests of Germania. About the defeat of 3 Roman legions under the command of Publius Quinctilius Varus. An entire army destroyed in an ambush. Thousands of soldiers lost among the trees. The memory still lingers in Roman minds like a warning. Forests are dangerous places. Especially when someone else knows them better than you do. Because of that lesson, Roman armies move cautiously in woodland terrain. Scouts ride ahead. Flank guards watch the edges of the column. Officers scan the tree line constantly. And soldiers tighten their grip on shields and spears. Just in case. But today, the forest remains quiet. The army marches safely through. Step. 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 Hours pass. The sun climbs higher. And slowly the forest opens into rolling hills once again. Another day without battle. Another day of marching. For many Roman soldiers, most days are like this. Marching. Training. Building camps. Preparing for battles that may or may not happen. War is not constant fighting. War is mostly waiting. Waiting with heavy equipment and sore feet. Eventually, the officers call a halt. Another campsite. Another ditch to dig. Another wall to build. The routine begins again. Because routine is what keeps an army alive. And Rome has become very, very good at staying alive. Night slowly falls across the camp. Fires flicker between the rows of tents. The smell of cooking grain drifts through the air. Soldiers sit together quietly, eating, resting, telling small stories from home. Some speak about distant farms. Others remember towns they may never see again. The empire stretches across continents. But soldiers still think about simple things. Warm food. Dry beds. Families far away. Above the camp, the stars appear one by one. Guards take their positions along the walls. The fires burn lower. And slowly the camp falls silent again. Tomorrow will bring another march. Another camp. Another day in the long life of a Roman legionary. And someday. Sooner or later. A battle. Morning returns again. It always does. And the Roman army greets it the same way it greets every morning, with discipline, noise, and the quiet understanding that comfort is not part of the schedule. You wake before the sun rises fully above the horizon. A thin gray light spreads across the camp. Mist drifts lazily over the shallow ditch surrounding the walls your hands helped dig yesterday evening. Somewhere along the rampart, a guard finishes the final hour of his watch, staring out into the distance with tired eyes and a spear resting against his shoulder. He has been awake all night. And in a few minutes, you will be awake all day. Balance, apparently, is not a Roman priority. The camp begins to stir. Leather creaks. Metal clinks. Someone coughs. Someone else mutters a complaint about the cold. Inside your tent, the other soldiers are rolling their blankets, rubbing sleep from their eyes, and preparing for another day that will likely look suspiciously similar to yesterday. Outside, a cook fire is already burning. Breakfast, once again, is dependable if not exciting. Grain boiled into a thick porridge. A small piece of bread. Maybe a few olives if supplies have been generous. Roman soldiers eat simply. But they eat consistently. And consistency, like discipline, is one of the small habits that builds large empires. After breakfast comes inspection. The centurion walks slowly through the rows of soldiers. His eyes are sharp. Nothing escapes his attention. A loose strap on a shield. A dull edge on a sword. A soldier whose armor has not been properly cleaned. Each mistake is noted. Each mistake is corrected. Sometimes loudly. Sometimes with extra duties. Because the Roman army believes deeply in the idea that small problems today become very large problems on a battlefield tomorrow. The horns sound again. Low, steady notes drifting through the morning air. This is the signal. Not for marching. Not yet. But for formation. The soldiers gather in open ground just beyond the camp walls. Lines form with practiced precision. Centuries assemble. Cohorts take shape. What looks from a distance like chaos quickly becomes something far more organized. Thousands of men arranged into a living structure of shields, spears, and discipline. Today, however, the mood feels slightly different. There is tension in the air. Scouts returned during the night. And they brought news. Enemy forces have been spotted nearby. Not far away. Perhaps only a few miles. That means today might not be another day of marching and digging. Today might be a day for something else. Word spreads quietly through the ranks. No one panics. Roman soldiers are trained for this. But the energy shifts. Men adjust their equipment more carefully. Straps are tightened. Helmets are secured. Shields are lifted and tested against the forearm. Even the centurions seem a little more focused than usual. The army begins to move. Slowly at first. The formations stretch across the countryside. Standard bearers carry tall poles topped with bronze symbols that glint in the rising sunlight. These standards are more than decorations. They are the heart of each unit. Lose your standard, and you've lost more than a battle. You've lost honor. Roman soldiers will risk everything to protect them. The road leads toward open land. A wide valley surrounded by low hills. Perfect ground for an army to fight. Which means it's also perfect ground for something else. Waiting. As the legion approaches the valley, the soldiers begin to see movement in the distance. Small shapes at first. Dark figures along the ridges. Enemy warriors gathering. Watching. Preparing. The officers move quickly now. Orders pass down the lines. Formations shift. Shields lift slightly higher. This is the moment where months, sometimes years, of training suddenly become very important. Because when battle begins, there is no time to think. Only time to react. The Roman soldiers arrange themselves in battle formation. Rows of shields overlapping. Lines of men standing shoulder to shoulder. Behind the front line stand more soldiers ready to step forward if needed. The structure is layered. Flexible. Strong. A Roman legion does not fight as individuals. It fights as a machine. Across the field, the enemy army begins to gather. Warriors shouting. Weapons raised. Bright banners waving in the wind. They are louder than the Romans. Much louder. Battle cries echo across the valley. Drums beat. Shields clash together in a rhythmic roar. It is meant to intimidate. To shake the courage of the soldiers standing across from them. But the Roman lines remain quiet. Almost eerily quiet. The soldiers wait. Shield steady. Eyes forward. Because Roman commanders understand something very important about battle. Noise is impressive. But discipline wins wars. The signal finally comes. A sharp call from the officers. The front rank step forward. Not running. Not charging wildly. Just walking. Slowly. Steadily. The massive shield wall advances across the field. Thousands of boots pressing into the earth in unison. Dust rising behind them like a slow-moving cloud. At a certain distance, another order is shouted. The soldiers in the front ranks pull their pilum javelins from their grips. Arms pull back. Then forward. Hundreds of javelins launch into the air at once. They arc across the battlefield like a sudden storm of iron. Seconds later they crash into enemy shields and armor. Many of them bending on impact exactly as designed. Shields become heavy. Awkward. Difficult to hold. The enemy line falters. Just slightly. But slightly is all Rome needs. Another command echoes across the Roman line. Now the soldiers move faster. Shields forward. Swords ready. The distance closes rapidly. And then the battle truly begins. Steel meets steel. Shields crash together. The calm discipline of the Roman line collides with the furious energy of the enemy charge. But Roman soldiers are trained for this moment. They do not swing wildly. They stab. Short, quick thrusts behind the shield. Controlled movements designed to conserve energy and maximize effectiveness. It is not flashy. But it is brutally efficient. The battlefield becomes a blur of motion and sound. Boots slipping in dirt. Metal striking metal. Officers shouting orders above the chaos. Standards rising above the crowd of soldiers so each unit knows where to stand. And slowly, almost invisibly at first, the Roman line begins to push forward. Not quickly. Not dramatically. Just steadily. Like a tide slowly rising against the shore. Because this is how Rome fights. Not with sudden bursts of heroism. But with patience. Structure. And the quiet determination of thousands of soldiers who have marched, trained, and built camps together for months. Maybe years. Eventually, the enemy line begins to bend. Then crack. Then break. Warriors start to fall back. Some run. Others fight desperately. But the structure holding their army together has begun to collapse. And once that happens, the battle is already ending. The Roman soldiers continue forward. Not chasing wildly. Not losing formation. Just pushing. Slowly reclaiming the battlefield one careful step at a time. When the fighting finally stops, the valley grows quiet again. The dust settles. The shouting fades. And the soldiers stand among the aftermath of a battle that may have lasted less than an hour. After weeks of marching. Months of preparation. Sometimes entire campaigns. War often ends surprisingly quickly. But the work is not over. Not even close. Because after every battle, there is another camp to build. The battle ends almost as suddenly as it began. One moment the air is full of shouting, metal, and chaos. The next moment, it isn't. The valley slowly grows quiet again. Not completely silent. But quieter. The kind of quiet that settles over a place where thousands of men were fighting only minutes earlier. You stand there for a moment, breathing heavily behind your shield. Your arm aches. Your throat feels dry. Your ears are still ringing from the noise of clashing weapons. Around you, the soldiers of the legion remain in formation. Because even when the fighting stops, discipline does not. The officers move quickly through the ranks. Centurions shout orders, reminding soldiers to hold position. No one rushes forward recklessly. Because one lesson Roman soldiers learn very quickly is that battles can surprise you. An enemy that looks defeated sometimes isn't. A retreat can become an ambush. So the line holds steady. Watching. Waiting. Only when the scouts confirm that the enemy has truly fled do the formations slowly begin to relax. The soldiers lower their shields. Some sit down immediately. Others lean on their spears, catching their breath. A few simply stare across the battlefield, still adjusting to the sudden silence. Battles can feel strangely unreal once they are over. Like a storm that passed quickly but left the landscape completely changed. Now comes the work that no one writes heroic poems about. The aftermath. Roman soldiers move carefully across the field. First checking for wounded comrades. Anyone still alive is brought back toward the camp. Roman military medicine is surprisingly advanced for its time. The army even maintains dedicated surgeons known as medici. They clean wounds. Remove arrowheads. Apply bandages soaked in wine or vinegar to prevent infection. It's not perfect. But compared to most armies of the ancient world, Roman soldiers have a much better chance of surviving their injuries. Meanwhile, other soldiers collect equipment scattered across the battlefield. Shields. Helmets. Weapons. Nothing useful is left behind. An army that marches constantly cannot afford to waste supplies. Sometimes enemy weapons are gathered too. If they are well made, they might be reused. If not, they are melted down later. Rome is practical like that. As the sun begins to lower in the sky, the army starts building another camp. Yes. Even after a battle. Because Roman commanders believe strongly that a secure camp is safer than celebrating in the open. So the routine begins again. Shovels dig trenches. Earth piles up into defensive walls. Wooden stakes are planted firmly into the ground. By evening, the familiar shape of a Roman camp appears once more. Neat rows of tents. Straight streets. Guard towers along the ramparts. An organized island of order in the middle of a chaotic world. Inside the camp, fires are lit. Soldiers sit together, eating simple meals. Grain porridge again. Bread. Maybe some meat taken from the supply wagons. After a day like this, even plain food tastes surprisingly satisfying. Because hunger, it turns out, is the best seasoning. Conversations are quiet tonight. Some soldiers speak about the battle. Comparing what they saw. Who fought bravely? Who nearly got themselves killed doing something foolish? Soldiers always remember the foolish moments. They tend to become stories told again and again around future campfires. Elsewhere in the camp, the officers are discussing something more serious. The next move. Because campaigns rarely end after a single battle. An enemy army might retreat to another city. Another valley. Another fortress. War is rarely tidy. Which means the marching will continue soon enough. And march they will. Roman legions under commanders like Julius Caesar often spent years on campaign far from home. Some soldiers traveled thousands of miles during their service. Across mountains. Across rivers. Through forests and deserts. Following the long roads that Rome built to keep its empire connected. Roman roads are famous for a reason. They are solid. Straight. Built with layers of stone designed to last for centuries. For soldiers on campaign, these roads are a blessing. Because marching 30 miles over smooth stone is much easier than marching through mud. Though to be honest, 30 miles is still 30 miles. And your feet will still complain about it. As darkness settles over the camp, the soldiers slowly prepare for sleep. Armor is stacked neatly. Shields are placed near the tent entrance. Weapons remain within reach. Just in case. Roman soldiers rarely sleep completely unprepared. The night sky above the camp fills with stars. Far from cities, the sky looks enormous. Thousands of tiny lights stretching endlessly above the quiet rows of tents. Some soldiers lie awake for a while, staring up at those stars. Thinking about distant homes far beyond the horizon. Farms. Families. Villages they haven't seen in years. Because service in the Roman army is long. Very long. A legionary typically serves around 25 years. That means a young recruit might join at 20. And not return home until nearly 50. If he survives. Which many do. But not all. Yet for many men, the army still offers something valuable. Pay. Regular food. And eventually, land grants after retirement. For a poor farmer's son, joining the army can mean opportunity. Hard opportunity. But opportunity nonetheless. Eventually the camp falls silent. Guards take their places along the walls. Fires burn low. And the soldiers sleep. Another battle behind them. Another march waiting tomorrow. Because the army of the Roman Empire never really stops moving. And somewhere ahead. Another road is waiting. Morning arrives again. Not gently. Not kindly. Just, inevitably. The first horn sounds across the camp before the sun has fully climbed over the hills. The sound carries through the cold air like a reminder that Roman soldiers do not decide when the day begins. The army decides. You open your eyes slowly. Your body feels heavier than usual today. Yesterday's battle has left its quiet marks. Your arm aches from holding the shield. Your shoulders protest as you sit up. And somewhere near your ankle, a bruise reminds you that Roman sandals are excellent for marching, but not particularly forgiving during combat. Still, you stand. Because everyone else is already standing. Outside the tent, the camp is waking once again. Fires crackle softly. A few soldiers are already heating water or stirring grain into another pot of morning porridge. Breakfast is quick. Always quick. Roman armies prefer movement to lingering. The faster a legion can march, the more dangerous it becomes to its enemies. And speed, surprisingly, is something heavy infantry can achieve with enough discipline. After breakfast, the familiar rhythm of military life resumes. Inspections. Equipment checks. Formations. But today, something else hangs quietly in the air. A lesson. Because yesterday's battle, while victorious, was not perfect. And the Roman army has a very particular way of dealing with imperfection. Discipline. The centurions gather the soldiers in open ground near the center of the camp. Lines form quickly. Thousands of legionaries standing quietly while officers walk slowly along the ranks. One centurion stops in front of a small group of soldiers. They look nervous. Which is rarely a good sign. Because Roman discipline is famously strict. The army believes that one careless soldier can endanger hundreds. So mistakes are corrected quickly. And sometimes harshly. For small offenses, the punishment might be simple. Extra labor. Cleaning duties. Carrying additional equipment during the next march. Roman soldiers already carry a great deal of gear. But a centurion can always find something heavier if he feels the need. For more serious failures, punishments become more unpleasant. One common punishment is called fustuarium. It is reserved for crimes like desertion, theft from fellow soldiers, or abandoning one's post during battle. If a soldier is found guilty, his punishment is carried out by the very men he served beside. The unit gathers. And the condemned soldier is beaten with clubs until he dies. It is not pleasant. It is not symbolic. It is meant to remind everyone else exactly how seriously Rome takes discipline. There is an even more infamous punishment whispered about in the legion. A punishment rarely used. But never forgotten. Decimation. The word itself carries a quiet chill among soldiers. If an entire unit shows cowardice or mutiny, commanders may order this terrifying measure. The soldiers are divided into groups of 10. Then lots are drawn. One man from each group is chosen by chance. The other 9 must carry out the execution. It is brutal. And intentionally so. Because Roman commanders believe fear of punishment can sometimes be stronger than fear of the enemy. Fortunately, decimation is rare. Very rare. But the mere possibility of it is enough to keep most soldiers focused on their duties. After discipline comes training again. Even after battle. Even after punishment. The Roman army trains constantly. Shield drills. Formation practice. Weapons exercises against wooden training posts. Roman training swords are often heavier than real ones. Which means when soldiers finally hold their actual weapons in battle, they feel lighter. Faster. Easier to control. It's a simple trick. But effective. By midday, the army prepares to march again. Campaigns do not pause for long. Victory in one battle simply means the road continues. Today the legion follows a Roman road stretching across rolling countryside. Stone slabs laid carefully across the earth. Engineered to last for centuries. These roads are one of the quiet secrets behind Rome's success. They allow armies to move quickly across enormous distances. A message sent from one province can travel across the empire with remarkable speed. And soldiers like you spend many long days walking across them. As the legion marches, the countryside slowly changes. Villages appear occasionally along the road. Farmers stop their work to watch the soldiers pass. Some wave politely. Others simply stare. The sight of thousands of armored men marching through your neighborhood is impressive. And perhaps slightly worrying. But Roman soldiers are expected to behave properly in friendly territory. Looting without permission is forbidden. Discipline extends beyond the battlefield. The army must represent the power and order of Rome. At least most of the time. By evening, the legion reaches another campsite. And once again the familiar routine begins. Dig the trench. Build the wall. Set the gates. Every Roman camp is built with the same careful design. Straight streets. Assigned areas for each unit. Even a central headquarters tent. To an outsider, it might look like a temporary city appearing overnight. To a Roman soldier, it's simply another day's work. Night falls slowly across the camp. Fires glow softly in the darkness. Soldiers eat quietly, exhausted from marching and building. Some laugh softly. Others simply sit and stare into the flames. Thinking about nothing in particular. Which can be surprisingly peaceful after a long day. Above the camp, the stars shine again. The same stars seen by travelers, farmers, merchants, and soldiers across the entire world. And somewhere far away, Rome itself continues to grow. Powered by the quiet effort of men like you. Marching. Building. Fighting. Sleeping. Then doing it all again tomorrow. The wind of the steppe rarely stopped. It didn't matter if the sun had just risen or if the moon was quietly sliding across the sky. Out there, on the vast grasslands of Central Asia, the wind was always doing something. Sometimes it whispered softly through the tall grass, and sometimes it roared like it had something very important to complain about. Either way, it never really went away. And if you were living in the world of the early Mongols, that wind would probably be the least of your daily concerns. Because life here was not built for comfort. It was built for movement. The people who lived on the steppe didn't stay in one place very long. Their homes weren't made of heavy stone or brick. Instead, they lived inside round felt tents called jers, portable homes made from wooden frames and thick wool felt that could be taken apart, loaded onto carts, and moved whenever the herds needed fresh pasture. And those herds were everything. Horses, sheep, goats, camels, and sometimes cattle formed the backbone of survival. Food, clothing, transportation, wealth, all of it came from animals. Which meant that if you were born here, chances were high that your first important life skill was learning how not to fall off a horse. Mongol children began riding astonishingly early. Some historians estimate that kids were riding confidently before the age of 5. Imagine a toddler, bundled in fur, gripping a small saddle while galloping across endless grassland. That was a normal childhood. And it needed to be. Because the steppe was enormous. Distances that would seem absurd to most medieval farmers were simply daily travel for nomadic herders. Riding 50 kilometers in a day wasn't impressive, it was expected. And the Mongol horse made that possible. The steppe horse was smaller than the horses used by European knights. Stockier. Tougher. Less glamorous, perhaps. But incredibly durable. These horses could survive brutal winters, dig through snow to reach grass, and travel for days with very little food. A Mongol rider didn't just have one horse either. They had several. During long journeys or military campaigns, riders would rotate between horses, allowing one to rest while another carried them forward. This system gave Mongol armies a terrifying advantage. While other armies exhausted their mounts after a few days, Mongol riders could keep going. And going. But before the Mongols became the unstoppable force that historians love to talk about, their world was far more chaotic. The steppe was not a single united empire. It was a patchwork of tribes. Some tribes were allies. Some were enemies. Many were both, depending on the week. Raiding between tribes was extremely common. Livestock could be stolen. People could be captured. Alliances could shift overnight. Survival meant being alert. It also meant being tough. Because winters on the steppe were no joke. Temperatures could plunge far below freezing. Blizzards could sweep across the plains without warning. Herd animals might die in large numbers during especially harsh seasons. And when the animals suffered, people suffered too. Food became scarce. Life became difficult. Yet the Mongols adapted to this environment with remarkable resilience. They drank fermented mare's milk, known as arag. They ate dried meat that could last for months. They used every part of the animals they raised. Nothing was wasted. Bones could become tools. Hide became clothing. Hair and wool became rope and felt. Even animal dung had a purpose, it could be dried and burned as fuel. In a place where trees were scarce, that mattered quite a lot. The Mongol diet might seem unusual to outsiders, but it was perfectly suited to the environment. High in protein. High in fat. Designed for long days of riding and working outdoors. And while life might seem harsh to us today, it also had a certain freedom. Nomadic societies were far more mobile than the settled kingdoms of Europe or China. People moved with the seasons. They followed the grass. They followed the animals. The land itself was their map. And in this constantly shifting world, leadership mattered immensely. Strong leaders could unite tribes. Weak leaders could lose everything. Which brings us, slowly and calmly, to a young boy who was born sometime around the year 1162. His name was Temujin. The world would later know him as Genghis Khan. But when his story began, things were not particularly promising. Temujin's father, Yasugei, was a tribal leader of moderate importance. Not a king. Not a conqueror. Just a respected figure among his people. Unfortunately for young Temujin, his father died when the boy was still very young, likely poisoned by rival Tatars during a feast. And when that happened, the family's situation collapsed almost immediately. Without Yasugei's leadership, his followers abandoned the family. Temujin, his mother, and his siblings were left alone on the steppe. No tribe. No protection. Very little food. Life became desperate. They survived by gathering wild plants, hunting small animals, and doing whatever they could to avoid starvation. At one point, according to traditional accounts, Temujin even killed his own half-brother during a dispute over food. Which sounds dramatic. But also tells us something about how severe their situation was. These were not comfortable years. They were survival years. Years that shaped Temujin into someone who understood exactly how fragile power could be. And perhaps more importantly, how valuable loyalty could be. Because when Temujin eventually began gathering followers of his own, he did something unusual for steppe politics. Instead of relying only on noble family lines, he promoted people based on loyalty and ability. A shepherd who proved brave in battle could rise through the ranks. A former enemy who proved trustworthy could become an ally. This merit-based system helped Temujin attract followers from many different tribes. Gradually, his influence grew. Alliances formed. Battles were fought. Enemies were defeated. And over several decades of conflict, Temujin slowly unified the Mongol tribes under his leadership. In 1206, at a great assembly called a Kurultai, he was officially declared Genghis Khan. the title roughly meant universal ruler. At the time, few people outside the steppe paid much attention. After all, the Mongols were just another nomadic group in a long history of nomadic groups. Surely they would raid a few neighbors, cause some trouble, and then fade away like so many others had. That assumption would turn out to be extremely incorrect. Because once the tribes were united, Genghis Khan began looking outward. Beyond the endless grasslands. Beyond the mountains. Toward the wealthy cities and empires that surrounded the steppe. Places like northern China, Central Asia, and the great trading cities along the Silk Road. Places filled with walls, markets, gold, and very large populations that had absolutely no experience dealing with an army that moved like the wind. And so, quietly at first, the Mongol expansion began. Armies assembled. Scouts rode far ahead. Messengers carried orders across incredible distances. And soon, the world beyond the steppe would begin to realize something important. The Mongols were not simply raiders. They were building an empire. One that would eventually stretch from the Pacific Ocean to Eastern Europe. But for now, out on the grasslands, the horses were still grazing. The wind was still blowing. And the riders were preparing for journeys that would change the course of history. The steppe, as it turned out, was an excellent training ground for conquest. Not intentionally, of course. The grasslands did not wake up one morning and decide to produce the most mobile military force the medieval world had ever seen. But the environment shaped the people who lived there in ways that made them uniquely suited for warfare across enormous distances. And as the newly proclaimed ruler of the Mongols, Genghis Khan understood this better than anyone. His army was not built like the armies of settled kingdoms. In Europe, a king might gather a collection of knights and foot soldiers. In China, emperors commanded massive infantry forces supported by bureaucratic systems and fortified cities. The Mongols did something different. Their army was essentially the entire society. Nearly every adult male was already an experienced rider and hunter. Archery was a daily skill, not a specialized military training. Riding across rough terrain was normal life. So when the call came to gather for war, most of the skills required were already there. But Genghis Khan added something that made this natural ability even more powerful. Organization. He restructured the Mongol forces using a strict decimal system. Groups of 10 men formed a unit called an arban. 10 arbans formed a unit of 100. 10 hundreds formed 1,000. And 10 thousands created a massive force known as a tumen. This system sounds simple, and it was. But it allowed the Mongol army to function with extraordinary discipline. Orders could move quickly through the ranks. Units could separate and regroup without confusion. Every soldier knew exactly where he belonged in the structure. And unlike many medieval armies, loyalty was not tied to family clans anymore. Genghis Khan deliberately mixed people from different tribes within the same units. This reduced the chance of tribal rebellions and forced soldiers to rely on the empire rather than their old clan loyalties. It was clever. Also slightly ruthless. But very effective. Training was constant. Even during peaceful times, Mongol warriors practiced riding, archery, and coordinated maneuvers. They hunted together in massive organized drives that mimicked military operations. One of these hunting exercises, known as the nurge, could involve thousands of riders slowly closing in on an enormous area of land, trapping animals inside. From a distance it looked almost like a living wall of horses. Animals had nowhere to escape. This exercise taught soldiers how to coordinate movements over huge distances, a skill that would later prove extremely useful on the battlefield. Of course, the most famous Mongol weapon was the bow. Not just any bow. The Mongol composite bow. It was a compact but incredibly powerful weapon made from layers of wood, horn, and sinew glued together. This design allowed it to store tremendous energy despite being small enough to use comfortably on horseback. A skilled archer could shoot accurately while galloping at full speed. Forward. backward, even while twisting around in the saddle. And Mongol riders carried dozens of arrows in their quivers. Some arrows were designed to penetrate armor. Others had broader heads for hunting. Some even had small holes that produced whistling sounds in the air, possibly used for signaling during battle. The Mongols were not just archers though. They were masters of mobility. A typical warrior traveled with several horses, sometimes as many as 5. When one horse became tired, he simply switched to another. This meant Mongol forces could travel astonishing distances in very short periods of time. European armies might march 20 miles in a day. Mongol riders could cover far more. And because they carried dried meat, fermented milk, and sometimes even drank small amounts of blood from their horses without killing them, they could survive with minimal supply lines. To settled civilizations, this kind of army was extremely difficult to deal with. Walls could stop infantry. Fortresses could delay cavalry. But an enemy that could appear suddenly, move rapidly, and vanish just as quickly created constant uncertainty. And uncertainty, as it turns out, is one of the most powerful psychological weapons in warfare. As the power of the Mongol Empire began to grow, their first major targets lay to the south. Northern China was ruled at the time by the Jin dynasty, a powerful state with fortified cities, large armies, and centuries of political experience. From the perspective of Chinese officials, the Mongols were simply another group of northern nomads. Troublesome perhaps, but manageable. This assumption was optimistic. The Mongols began testing the Jin defenses in the early 1200s, launching raids across the frontier. At first these attacks were relatively small. Fast-moving cavalry units struck border settlements, gathered supplies, and withdrew before large Jin armies could respond. But gradually the raids grew larger and more organized. By 1211, full-scale invasion had begun. Mongol forces swept through northern territories, defeating Jin armies in a series of battles that shocked many observers. Part of the Mongol success came from tactics that were unfamiliar to many of their opponents. One famous method was the feigned retreat. In this maneuver, Mongol riders would attack briefly and then appear to panic and flee the battlefield. Enemy forces, believing victory was near, often gave chase. But the retreating riders were not actually fleeing. They were leading the enemy into a trap. At the right moment, Mongol units would suddenly turn around while hidden forces attacked from the sides. What had looked like a victory quickly became a disaster. These tactics required incredible discipline and communication between units, something the Mongols had spent years perfecting. And as the campaigns continued, the empire expanded rapidly. Cities fell. Trade routes shifted. New peoples came under Mongol control. Yet it would be a mistake to imagine the Mongols as purely destructive. Yes, their wars could be devastating. But they were also skilled administrators once territories were conquered. Merchants were often protected. Trade across the Silk Road increased under Mongol rule. Messengers traveled across the empire using a relay system of stations where fresh horses were always waiting. This network, called the Yam, allowed information to move across thousands of kilometers with surprising speed. A messenger could ride into a station, deliver a message, switch horses, and continue riding almost immediately. Over long distances, this system was far faster than anything most medieval states could manage. It helped the Mongol Empire function as a connected empire despite its enormous size. And as the Mongol armies pushed farther west, the rest of the world slowly began to realize something remarkable. These riders from the steppe were not just passing raiders. They were reshaping the map of Eurasia. Kingdoms that had existed for centuries would soon face a force unlike any they had encountered before. But back on the steppe, life still followed the rhythms it always had. Horses grazed. Children practiced riding. Families packed and unpacked their gears as the seasons changed. And somewhere in the distance, a group of riders might already be moving across the horizon, small dark shapes against the endless grass. Traveling quietly. Traveling quickly. Preparing for the next chapter in the long and surprisingly quiet rise of the Mongols. The expansion of the Mongol Empire did not happen all at once. It moved outward slowly at first, like ripples spreading across a lake after a stone is dropped into the water. One campaign led to another. One victory opened the path for the next. And before long, the riders of the steppe were traveling into lands that most Mongols had only heard about in stories from merchants. One of those lands was ruled by a powerful state known as the Khwarezmian Empire. This empire stretched across large parts of Central Asia and Persia, controlling important trade cities along the Silk Road. Wealthy markets, caravan routes, and bustling towns connected distant cultures through commerce. Silk, spices, silver, textiles, precious stones, all moved along these routes. And merchants carried not just goods, but news. Stories of the growing power of Genghis Khan had already begun circulating among traders. Some described the Mongols as unstoppable horsemen who appeared like a storm on the horizon. Others dismissed them as exaggerated rumors from nervous travelers. But then something happened that would change everything. According to historical accounts, Genghis Khan initially sought peaceful trade with the Khwarezmian ruler. Trade was valuable. Merchants brought wealth, information, and connections to distant regions. So a caravan of Mongol traders was sent toward a Khwarezmian city. What happened next depends on the sources, but the general story is widely accepted. The governor of the city suspected the merchants of spying. Whether this suspicion was justified or not is still debated by historians. But instead of allowing the caravan to continue its journey, the governor had the merchants arrested. And eventually executed. Their goods were seized. From the Mongol perspective, this was not just an insult. It was a serious diplomatic offense. So Genghis Khan did something interesting. Instead of immediately declaring war, he sent envoys to the Khwarezmian ruler, demanding justice. The envoys were messengers, representatives meant to negotiate a peaceful resolution. Unfortunately, the situation only became worse. One of the envoys was reportedly executed, while the others were sent back humiliated. This was a very bad decision. Because in Mongol culture, harming envoys was considered a grave violation. It meant diplomacy had failed completely. And when diplomacy failed, the Mongols tended to respond in a very decisive manner. Soon after, the armies of the Mongol Empire began moving west. But they did not move as one massive army. Instead, they split into multiple coordinated forces. This was another hallmark of Mongol strategy. Rather than marching together in a slow and predictable formation, Mongol generals often spread their forces across enormous distances. Several armies might advance hundreds of kilometers apart. From the perspective of their enemies, it became extremely difficult to predict where the next attack would come from. Cities that believed they were safe suddenly found Mongol riders appearing on the horizon. And those riders were not alone. Entire 2 months, units of 10,000 soldiers, could arrive with astonishing speed. One by one, major cities of the Khwarezmian Empire fell. Some resisted fiercely. Others surrendered quickly, hoping for mercy. The Mongols sometimes accepted surrender and allowed cities to survive under new rule. But cities that resisted and were later captured often faced harsh consequences. Word of these events spread rapidly across Central Asia. And that was partly the point. Psychological warfare played a major role in Mongol strategy. If enough cities surrendered without resistance, campaigns became easier and faster. Fear traveled faster than armies. Yet it is important to remember that the Mongols were not simply destroying everything in their path. They also relied heavily on skilled individuals from conquered territories. Engineers, artisans, scholars, and administrators were often spared and brought into Mongol service. These specialists helped the empire function. Siege engineers from China, for example, taught the Mongols how to build and operate powerful siege machines. Catapults. Trebuchets. Siege towers. With these tools, the Mongols became increasingly capable of capturing heavily fortified cities, something nomadic armies had struggled with in earlier centuries. The empire was learning, adapting, growing more sophisticated with each campaign. Meanwhile, life inside a Mongol military camp was surprisingly organized. At the end of a long day's ride, soldiers would set up their jars in neat formations. Horses were tended carefully. They were brushed, checked for injuries, and allowed to graze. Food was prepared from simple ingredients, dried meat, milk products, sometimes grain obtained through trade or conquest. Fires burned low against the cold night air. Conversations drifted through the camp. Stories were shared. Some warriors repaired their equipment. Others practiced archery even after the sun had set. Discipline remained constant. Despite their reputation as fierce warriors, Mongol soldiers followed strict rules within the army. Looting without permission could be punished. Disobedience could lead to severe consequences. This discipline helped maintain order across forces that sometimes operated thousands of kilometers away from their homeland. And communication across those distances relied on one of the most remarkable systems in the medieval world: the Yan network. Relay stations were placed along major routes across the empire. At each station, fresh horses waited. When a messenger arrived carrying official orders, he could change horses immediately and continue riding. Another station would appear many kilometers ahead. And another after that. Messages that might take weeks in other empires could move across Mongol territory in days. This system allowed leaders to coordinate campaigns across incredible distances. It also helped merchants travel safely along trade routes. Because under Mongol rule, trade was strongly encouraged. Merchants were often granted special passports known as peza, which allowed them to use relay stations and receive protection along the roads. The result was something historians sometimes call the Pax Mongolica, a period when trade across Eurasia became unusually active. Goods traveled from China to the Middle East. Ideas moved between cultures. Technologies spread. Even travelers from Europe began making the long journey eastward. Among them was a young Venetian merchant who would later become famous for describing his travels across the Mongol world. His name was Marco Polo. But that part of the story comes later. For now, the empire continued expanding under the leadership of Genghis Khan. Armies rode across deserts, through mountains, across rivers that seemed impossibly wide. Each campaign added new lands to the growing domain of the Mongol Empire. And yet, even as the empire expanded across continents, the heart of Mongol life remained tied to the steppe. To the horses. To the wind moving across endless grass. Where riders still appeared as small silhouettes against the horizon. Traveling quietly. Traveling steadily. Carrying with them the story of an empire that was still only beginning its long journey across history. The wind moves slowly across the steppe tonight. It pushes the tall grass in quiet waves that roll out toward the dark horizon, the same way they have for thousands of years. Somewhere in the distance a horse snorts softly, stamping the ground once before settling again. The camp of the Mongol Empire rests under a sky so full of stars it almost looks crowded. You sit beside a small fire, turning a strip of dried meat slowly in your hands. The day's ride has been long. But long rides are normal now. Out here, distance is measured less in miles and more in how tired your horse becomes. And your horse is very tired. He stands a few steps away, head lowered, quietly chewing the last of the grass he managed to find before darkness settled across the plain. Tomorrow he will run again, just like he did today, and just like he will every day for as long as this campaign continues. Because the army is still moving. Even though the empire already stretches across enormous lands, the ambitions of Genghis Khan are far from finished. Somewhere near the center of the camp, larger fires burn. Those belong to the commanders. Generals speak quietly there, discussing the next stage of the campaign. Maps made from memory are drawn in the dirt using sticks and stones. The Mongols do not rely heavily on written charts. Instead they carry something even more reliable. Experience. Scouts have already returned with reports about the land ahead. They describe rivers, towns, narrow passes through hills, and the positions of enemy forces. Information travels quickly through the Mongol army. Every rider knows his role. Every unit understands where it must go. Because Mongol strategy often depends on movement across huge distances, coordination is everything. Entire armies might ride separately for weeks, only to appear suddenly from different directions at exactly the right moment. For their enemies, it can feel almost supernatural. But in reality, it is the result of careful planning and constant communication. Messengers ride between units throughout the night, carrying orders sealed with the authority of Genghis Khan himself. Their horses change frequently. Fresh mounts are taken whenever possible so that the messages never stop moving. Sleep for these riders is rare. But the empire depends on them. By morning the camp begins stirring again. The sun rises slowly across the steppe, turning the frost on the grass into thousands of tiny sparks of light. Someone nearby yawns loudly. Another soldier stretches his back with a quiet groan. It seems everyone's body complains a little more each day. War is exhausting. Even for people who grew up riding horses across endless grasslands. You pull on your boots and tighten the leather straps around your armor. It is not heavy armor like the knights of Europe wear. Mongol warriors prefer mobility. Your protection comes mostly from hardened leather and small plates sewn carefully together. Enough to stop a glancing blow. Not enough to slow you down. Because speed is survival. Soon the familiar sound fills the air again. Horses being saddled. Leather creaking. Bridles snapping into place. Hundreds of riders preparing to move. The army does not march like the heavy infantry of distant empires. It flows. Like water across the land. Units ride out in loose formations, spreading across the plains so that grass and water can support the enormous number of animals traveling together. Each warrior usually rides with several spare horses. When one becomes tired, he simply changes mounts and continues. This is another secret of Mongol endurance. While enemies struggle to keep their single warhorse alive during long campaigns, Mongol riders move from horse to horse with practiced efficiency. It allows them to travel extraordinary distances. Sometimes covering more ground in a few days than other armies manage in a week. As the riders move forward, the landscape slowly begins to change. The wide open grasslands give way to rolling hills and scattered forests. Small farming villages appear occasionally along the distant roads. For many of the people living here, the arrival of Mongol riders is both terrifying and fascinating. Stories about the armies of Genghis Khan have spread far ahead of the actual soldiers. Merchants carry the rumors. Travelers whisper the warnings. Entire towns sometimes empty themselves before the Mongols even arrive. Fear, once again, travels faster than horses. And the Mongols understand the usefulness of that fear. Sometimes a city will surrender the moment scouts appear on the horizon. Gates open. Envoys come out carrying gifts and promises of loyalty. If the surrender is accepted, the city may survive largely untouched. Taxes are collected. Officials are appointed. Trade continues. But if a city chooses to resist, history has shown that the consequences can be very severe. By midday the army pauses briefly near a shallow river. Horses drink eagerly. Soldiers refill their water skins. A few riders wash dust from their faces before quickly remounting. Long stops are rare during campaigns. Momentum is important. If the army slows too much, enemies might regroup or escape. So after only a short rest, the riders continue again. Across fields. Over hills. Toward whatever waits beyond the next horizon. As evening approaches, the army begins forming another temporary camp. Yurts rise quickly as soldiers work together with practiced hands. Wooden frames unfold. Thick felt coverings are pulled over the curved structures. Within an hour, what looked like an empty plain becomes a small city of tents and fires. Dinner tonight is simple. Boiled meat. Fermented mare's milk. A thick broth made from bones that have been cooking slowly all afternoon. The food is not luxurious. But it is filling. And after a day of riding through cold wind and dust, that is enough. Later, as the fire burns lower, someone begins telling a story. Stories travel through the Mongol camps just like orders do. Stories about past battles. Stories about distant lands the riders have seen. And stories about the man who brought all of this together. The boy once called Temujin. The man who would become Genghis Khan. His life has already become legend among the soldiers who follow him. They speak of the hardships he endured when he was young. The betrayals. The alliances. The battles fought long before the empire existed. To them, he is more than just a ruler. He is proof that the impossible can sometimes become real. The fire crackles softly as the story continues. Above the camp, the stars appear once more. The horses settle down. The riders pull their cloaks tighter against the growing cold. And slowly, one by one, the warriors of the Mongol Empire drift into sleep. Because tomorrow will bring another long ride. Another horizon. Another chapter in the quiet, relentless expansion of an empire carried on horseback across half the world. The night fades slowly across the steppe. Cold air drifts through the Mongol camp as the last of the firewood turns into glowing embers. Somewhere a horse shifts its weight, the quiet thud of hooves muffled by the grass. You wake before the sun again, not because you want to, but because the entire army of the Mongol Empire is already beginning to stir. This is how most mornings begin. No bells. No ceremony. Just movement. Someone nearby coughs. Another warrior pours a wooden bowl of fermented mare's milk, the sharp smell drifting through the cold air. A boy barely old enough to shave walks past carrying a saddle nearly the size of his torso. No one comments on it. Out here, childhood ends the moment you can stay on a horse. You pull your cloak tighter and step outside the yurt. The eastern horizon glows faintly now. Another day of riding is about to begin. Life inside the Mongol army moves with a rhythm that becomes almost predictable. Ride. Scout. Camp. Sleep. Then repeat. But occasionally, the rhythm breaks. Because today, something unusual is happening. Messengers have arrived during the night. Their horses are covered in foam and sweat, their saddles dusty from an exhausting ride across many miles of open land. When riders arrive like that, everyone knows the news must be important. The commanders gather near the largest yurt in the camp. Inside, decisions are being made. Orders from Genghis Khan himself. Word begins spreading quietly among the soldiers. The army will not simply continue riding east or west today. Instead, several units will split off. Different directions. Different targets. This is one of the defining strategies of the Mongol military. While many armies prefer to move together in a single massive force, Mongol commanders often divide their warriors into separate columns. Each group moves independently, traveling through valleys, forests, and open plains far from the others. To outsiders, it might look like the army is scattering. But in reality, it is preparing something far more complicated. A convergence. Multiple forces riding toward the same region from different directions. When they arrive at the same time, the enemy suddenly finds itself surrounded. Not by chance. But by design. The riders mount their horses again. Leather straps tighten. Bows are checked. Arrows are counted. Every warrior carries dozens of them, sometimes more than 100 depending on the mission. Each arrow has a specific purpose. Some are heavy and designed to pierce armor. Others are lighter for long-distance shots. A few have special whistling tips that produce an eerie sound when fired through the air. Those are often used during battle to send signals across the chaos of combat. Or sometimes simply to frighten enemies who have never heard such sounds before. Psychology matters in war. And the Mongols understand that better than most. Soon your unit begins moving. The horses trot steadily across the plain, the rhythm of hooves creating a steady, almost hypnotic sound. Riders spread out across the land, leaving wide spaces between them so the animals can graze as they travel. It may look disorganized to someone unfamiliar with steppe warfare. But every rider knows where he belongs. Every unit understands the direction it must follow. This is possible because of something that binds the entire empire together. The law. More specifically, the legal code created under Genghis Khan, often referred to as the Yasa. The Yasa is not written down in one neat document like many legal systems. Instead, it exists as a collection of rules and traditions that govern the behavior of the Mongol people and their armies. Some rules are simple. Stealing from fellow soldiers is forbidden. Disobeying orders can be punished severely. Cowardice in battle is unacceptable. But other laws deal with daily life across the expanding empire. For example, religious tolerance is encouraged. Buddhists, Muslims, Christians, and many other faiths exist within Mongol territories, and most are allowed to practice freely. The Mongol rulers often care more about loyalty and taxes than about what God's people worship. This policy helps keep peace among the many cultures now living under Mongol rule. And there are many. Because the empire is enormous. As the riders continue across the countryside, you pass groups of travelers moving slowly along a dusty trade road. Merchants with carts. Pack animals carrying silk and spices. Caravans guarded by hired soldiers. Trade has become surprisingly active under Mongol rule. The long routes connecting East Asia, Central Asia, and the Middle East are now safer than they have been in centuries. Bandits know the punishment for attacking merchants in Mongol territory can be severe. So many simply disappear. This period of stability along the trade routes will later be remembered by historians as the Pax Mongolica. A time when goods, ideas, and technologies traveled across Eurasia more easily than before. Paper money from China. Gunpowder weapons. Medical knowledge. Astronomy. Even recipes and cooking techniques begin traveling between distant cultures. Empires sometimes spread destruction. But they also spread connections. And the Mongol Empire does both. By afternoon the weather begins to shift. Dark clouds gather slowly over the distant hills. Wind sweeps across the plains, carrying the smell of rain. Storms on the steppe can appear suddenly. And when they arrive with force. Soon heavy drops begin falling across the land. The riders pull their cloaks tighter as the rain turns the ground muddy and slick. Horses lower their heads against the wind, pushing forward steadily despite the weather. Stopping would mean losing valuable time. So the army continues. Slowly. Patiently. Through the storm. Eventually, as evening approaches, the rain fades. The clouds drift away. And the sky begins clearing once more. Camp is made near a small river. Yurts rise again like mushrooms after rain. Fires crackle. Wet cloaks are hung out to dry. Dinner tonight tastes especially good after the cold ride. Even simple boiled meat and broth can feel like a feast when you've spent hours riding through wind and rain. Later that night, as you lie wrapped in wool beside your saddle, the camp grows quiet. Only the soft sounds of horses grazing and the low murmur of distant voices remain. Somewhere out there in the darkness, scouts are still riding. Watching. Listening. Making sure no enemy approaches the sleeping camp. Because even an army as powerful as the Mongol Empire cannot afford to become careless. Not on the endless steppe. Not in a world where tomorrow might bring another battle. Another city. Another story waiting to be written in the long history of the riders who followed Genghis Khan across half the world. And as the stars slowly drift across the sky above you, sleep finally comes. Because tomorrow, the horses will move again. And so will you. Morning arrives quietly on the steppe. The cold has settled into the ground during the night, and when you open your eyes the world feels stiff and silent. Frost clings to the grass outside the yurt, and your breath turns into a pale cloud every time you exhale. For a moment, the camp of the Mongol Empire is still. Then the horses begin moving. A snort here. A shuffle there. Leather creaks as someone tightens a saddle strap. Another day has begun. You sit up slowly, brushing bits of dried grass from your cloak. Sleeping on the ground never really becomes comfortable, but after enough months of campaign life your body stops complaining quite so loudly. Nearby, someone is already heating water over a small iron pot. It smells faintly of boiled bones and fermented milk. Breakfast. It is not glamorous. But it will keep you alive. And out here, that is what matters. As the sun climbs slowly over the horizon, the vast landscape begins to reveal itself again. Rolling grasslands stretch as far as you can see. No walls. No towers. No cities. Just the open steppe that shaped the people who built the empire of Genghis Khan. For the Mongols, this environment is not empty. It is home. Every hill, every river, every patch of grazing land means something. The steppe teaches patience. It teaches endurance. And most importantly, it teaches movement. Standing still too long out here is rarely a good idea. Soon riders begin forming small groups again. Your unit has new instructions today. Scouting. This is one of the most important roles in the Mongol military system. Before the main army moves into unfamiliar territory, scouts spread out in every direction. They ride fast and light, carrying little more than bows, arrows, and enough supplies to survive several days alone. Their job is simple. Find information. And bring it back quickly. Where are the enemy forces? Which roads are safe? Where can horses find water and grass? These questions determine whether an army succeeds or fails. And Mongol commanders value good scouts almost as much as good warriors. You mount your horse and ride out with the others. The camp quickly disappears behind you. Within an hour, the army itself is nothing more than a distant cluster of dark shapes on the horizon. By midday, even that is gone. Just you. Your companions. And the wide open world. This kind of independence would terrify soldiers from many other armies. But for steppe riders, it feels natural. Many Mongols grew up traveling across these lands long before they ever joined a military campaign. Children learn to ride almost before they learn to walk. A bow becomes familiar long before adulthood. So when scouts travel far from the main force, they are not lost. They are simply returning to a lifestyle they already understand. As the day passes, the terrain begins changing slightly. The endless grasslands give way to scattered forests and low hills. Small farming communities appear occasionally in the distance. Thin trails of smoke rise from wooden houses. Fields of grain ripple gently in the wind. These villages belong to people who live very differently from the nomadic riders passing through their lands. Farmers stay in one place. They build homes. They plant crops. They measure time by seasons instead of distance traveled. To the Mongols, this life can seem strangely fragile. A house cannot move if enemies arrive. A field cannot ride away from danger. And yet these settlements produce food and goods that nomadic societies often rely on. So the relationship between steppe warriors and farming communities has always been complicated. Sometimes peaceful. Sometimes violent. Often both. You and the other scouts stop briefly on a ridge overlooking a wide valley. From here you can see a narrow road winding through the land below. And on that road, something interesting appears. A caravan. Several wagons pulled by oxen. Pack animals carrying large bundles wrapped in cloth. Merchants. Even from this distance, you can recognize the familiar shapes of trade goods. Silk. Spices. Possibly metal tools or pottery. Caravans like this move along the great network of trade routes known as the Silk Road. These roads connect distant parts of the world, from China to Persia, from Central Asia all the way to Europe. Under the rule of the Mongol Empire, many of these routes have become safer than they were before. Bandits know the punishment for attacking merchants protected by Mongol authority. And the Mongols themselves benefit from the trade. Taxes. Information. Foreign goods. All of it strengthens the empire. You watch the caravan for a while. But there is no reason to approach. Your mission is observation, not interaction. So after noting their direction and numbers, the scouts turn their horses again. Back toward the army. Back toward the next stage of the campaign. When you return to camp that evening, the atmosphere feels slightly different. Quieter. More serious. Word has spread that a major battle may be approaching. Enemy forces have been sighted several days' ride ahead. Nothing is certain yet. But the commanders are preparing. Weapons are checked more carefully. Arrows are repaired. Extra horses are rested for the coming days. Warriors speak a little less around the evening fires. Everyone knows that the calm routine of scouting and riding may soon give way to something far more dangerous. Because when armies finally meet on the battlefield, everything changes. The quiet steppe becomes filled with thunder. Hooves pounding. Bowstrings snapping. Shouts echoing across the land. And in those moments, the strategy and discipline created by Genghis Khan will be tested once again. Night settles slowly over the camp. The stars return. Bright. Cold. Endless above the dark plain. You lie down beside your saddle, wrapping your cloak tightly around your shoulders. Nearby, horses breathe softly as they rest. Tomorrow will likely bring hard riding. Possibly battle. But for now, the riders of the Mongol Empire sleep beneath the same sky that has watched over the steppe for thousands of years. And somewhere in the distance, beyond the hills and rivers waiting ahead, history continues moving forward. One hoofbeat at a time. The night passes slowly. Somewhere in the darkness a guard shifts his weight beside the edge of camp, stamping his feet against the cold. The wind moves softly across the steppe, carrying the distant sound of grazing horses and the faint crackle of dying campfires. Above you, the sky is filled with stars. The same sky that stretches across the enormous lands now ruled by the Mongol Empire. From the mountains of Central Asia to the cities of northern China, from the deserts of Persia to the forests of Eastern Europe, riders carrying the authority of Genghis Khan move across continents. But tonight, the world feels quiet. Almost peaceful. For a few more hours. Before sunrise, the camp begins to stir again. You hear it first in small sounds. Leather straps tightening. Boots scraping against frozen ground. A horse snorting impatiently. Someone coughs nearby. The army is waking. No one shouts orders. They rarely need to. By now, every warrior understands the rhythm of campaign life. Wake. Mount. Ride. Repeat. The eastern sky slowly begins turning pale gray. Cold mist hangs low across the grass as riders move quietly through the camp, saddling their horses. You finish tying the last knot on your gear and swing yourself into the saddle. Your horse flicks its ears back toward you, as if asking whether today will be another long ride. The answer is almost always yes. Because movement is the lifeblood of the Mongol army. Heavy armies march. Mongol armies flow. Like rivers across the land. Soon the riders begin leaving camp in long scattered lines. Your unit rides toward the low hills that rise slowly in the distance. Scouts reported something unusual there yesterday. Smoke. Tracks. Signs of another army moving nearby. That information has reached the commanders. And now everyone rides a little more carefully. The steppe gradually gives way to rougher land. Rolling hills break the endless flat horizon. Small forests appear in clusters. This terrain is less perfect for cavalry warfare, but Mongol riders have learned to adapt to almost any environment. After all, their campaigns have already taken them across deserts, mountains, and frozen rivers. Compared to those places, a few hills are hardly an obstacle. As the morning continues, the scouts ahead begin signaling back. Small flags. Quick gestures. Nothing dramatic. But enough to change the mood instantly. The enemy is close. Very close. The army slows slightly. Not stopping. Just tightening its formation. More riders appear from different directions as the separated units gradually converge. The strategy that commanders planned days earlier is now coming together. Columns of cavalry that rode separately across hundreds of miles are arriving at the same moment. This is one of the most terrifying aspects of Mongol warfare. To an enemy army, it can feel as if riders are appearing out of nowhere. From the north. From the west. From behind hills. Across rivers. Suddenly the battlefield fills with horsemen. And escape becomes very difficult. You ride over the top of a hill and finally see them. Far below in the valley. Another army. Lines of infantry forming near a small river. Spears. Shields. Banners moving in the wind. They are preparing for battle. But they are not fully aware of how many Mongol riders are already nearby. Because while they see the force approaching from the front, they do not yet see the other riders moving quietly behind them. Orders move quickly through the Mongol ranks. Messengers gallop between units. Flags rise. Bows are checked again. Quivers adjusted. Your heart beats a little faster now. Not from fear exactly. More like anticipation. Because every warrior in the army knows how this usually begins. The first arrows come from far away. Much farther than most armies expect. Mongol composite bows are powerful weapons, made from layers of wood, horn, and sinew carefully bound together. In the hands of skilled riders, they can strike enemies at distances that feel almost unfair. You draw your bow. Twist slightly in the saddle. Release. The arrow disappears into the distance. Then another. And another. Soon the quiet valley fills with the sound of bowstrings snapping again and again. The enemy army reacts quickly. Shields rise. Soldiers tighten their formations. But the Mongol riders do not charge directly. Not yet. Instead they circle. Always moving. Always firing. It is like watching a storm slowly gather strength. Arrows fall from different directions. Horses dart in and out of range. Some riders retreat suddenly, tempting the enemy to follow. Others appear behind their lines moments later. The battle becomes confusing. Chaotic. Exactly the way Mongol commanders prefer it. Hours pass in this strange rhythm of motion and attack. The enemy grows tired. Their formations loosen. And that is when the real danger begins. Because when the moment is right, the riders stop circling. And they charge. By late afternoon, the valley grows quiet again. Smoke drifts slowly across the battlefield. Broken shields lie scattered in the grass. The Mongol riders move carefully among the fallen, collecting arrows that can be used again. War is brutal. But resources are never wasted. As the sun begins to sink toward the horizon, the army regroups. Horses drink from the river. Warriors clean their weapons. Another battle has ended. Another small step in the enormous expansion of the Mongol Empire. That night the campfires burn a little brighter than usual. Not because of celebration. Mongol armies rarely celebrate loudly after victory. But because soldiers know they have survived another day. And on campaigns that stretch across continents, survival is always worth a quiet moment of rest beneath the endless sky. The fire burns low. Most of the camp has fallen asleep now. Only a few guards remain awake, standing near the edges of the camp with bows resting across their shoulders. Horses graze quietly in the darkness, occasionally lifting their heads when the wind shifts across the steppe. You lie wrapped in thick wool blankets, staring up at the sky. The stars feel impossibly bright tonight. Out here, far from cities and walls, the sky always looks larger. Endless. Ancient. It is the same sky that watched the rise of the Mongol Empire and the man who started it all, Genghis Khan. And lately, people have been whispering about him. Not loudly. Never loudly. But quietly, around fires like this one. Because even the greatest leaders are not immune to time. The next morning arrives like all the others. Cold. Quiet. And fast. You wake to the sound of horses shifting and leather creaking as riders prepare for another day of travel. Someone passes around a bowl of fermented mare's milk. Another soldier chews dried meat slowly while tightening the straps of his saddle. Life inside a Mongol army is simple. Eat when you can. Sleep when you can. Ride whenever the army moves. But something unusual happens today. Messengers arrive. They ride hard into the camp, horses lathered with sweat, their faces serious. Riders like this usually bring news from the heart of the empire. And today the news spreads quickly. Genghis Khan is dead. No one shouts. No one panics. The Mongol army is disciplined enough to remain calm. But the mood shifts instantly. Because the man who united the tribes of the steppe, the man who built the largest land empire in history, the man whose name terrified kings across Asia and Europe, is gone. The circumstances of his death are strange. Even today, historians are not completely certain how it happened. Some stories say he died after falling from a horse during a hunting expedition. Others claim illness weakened him during a campaign against the Western Xia dynasty. There are even legends suggesting more dramatic causes. But the truth may never be known. The Mongols kept his death secret for a time to avoid disrupting the army. And when his funeral procession finally began, it followed a strange and solemn tradition. According to some historical accounts, soldiers escorting the body killed anyone they encountered along the route so the location of his burial would remain hidden. His grave, somewhere in the vast landscapes of Mongolia, has never been definitively discovered. Even today, the final resting place of Genghis Khan remains one of history's greatest mysteries. But an empire cannot stop simply because its founder is gone. Leadership must pass to someone new. After careful discussion among the Mongol leaders, the throne eventually goes to one of his sons. Ogidi Khan. He becomes the next great Khan, ruler of the expanding empire. And under his leadership, the Mongol conquests do not slow down. In fact, they accelerate. New campaigns begin almost immediately. Armies ride west toward lands many Mongols have never seen before. Cold forests. Stone castles. Wide rivers. They are entering the territories of Europe. Kingdoms that believe distance alone will protect them from the riders of the steppe. But distance has never stopped a Mongol army before. One of the most famous clashes during this expansion happens in 1241. Near a small town in modern-day Poland. At a battle known as the Battle of Legnica. European knights gather to stop the Mongol advance. Heavy cavalry wearing thick armor. War banners fluttering in the wind. They expect a traditional medieval battle. Lances. Charges. Clashing swords. Instead, they face something completely different. The Mongols begin with familiar tactics. Horse archers riding in wide circles. Arrows falling from the sky. European knights try to charge. But the Mongols retreat. Slowly. Carefully. It looks like the enemy is fleeing. So the knights pursue. Which is exactly what the Mongol commanders want. Because the retreat is not real. It is a trap. Suddenly the riders turn. More Mongol units appear from the flanks. Arrows fly again from every direction. The knights, heavy and slow in their armor, struggle to respond to the constantly moving horse archers. Confusion spreads across the battlefield. Then panic. By the end of the day, the Mongols stand victorious. Another army defeated. Another kingdom learning that the riders from the steppe fight very differently from the wars Europe is used to. News of Mongol victories spreads quickly across the continent. Kings begin preparing defenses. Cities reinforce their walls. Church bells ring in distant towns as rumors of the unstoppable army move westward. But fate intervenes in an unexpected way. In 1241, word reaches the Mongol commanders in Europe. Ogedei Khan has died. And Mongol tradition requires the princes of the empire to return home to choose the next great Khan. So the armies withdraw. Not because they were defeated. Not because Europe successfully resisted them. But because the politics of empire demanded their presence elsewhere. History turns on strange moments like this. Had that message arrived a year later, the map of Europe might look very different today. Back on the steppe, the empire continues evolving. New leaders rise. New territories fall under Mongol control. Eventually one of the most famous rulers of the dynasty will appear. A grandson of Genghis Khan. A man named Kublai Khan. And under his rule, the Mongols will do something extraordinary. They will conquer all of China and establish a new dynasty known as the Yuan dynasty. But that story, like so many others in the long history of the Mongols, will unfold slowly. Across battles. Across cities. Across the endless grasslands that shape the riders of the steppe. And tonight, as the campfires glow quietly beneath the open sky, the riders of the Mongol Empire rest once again. Because tomorrow the horses will move. And history will keep riding forward with them. The Mongol camp wakes before the sun. Not because people want to. But because the horses are already awake. Thousands of them. They stamp the ground. They snort clouds of steam into the freezing air. Leather saddles creak as riders check straps that have been repaired more times than anyone remembers. You open your eyes inside a felt gur, the round tent that Mongol families carry with them across the grasslands. The air smells faintly of smoke and fermented milk. Your blanket is made of sheep wool. It is warm. But the cold outside is waiting. The Mongols do not live in permanent cities here. The steppe is their home, a rolling ocean of grass stretching across what we now call Mongolia, northern China, Kazakhstan, and beyond. No fences. No stone walls. Just wind. And horses. Every Mongol child learns to ride almost as soon as they can walk. Not in a cute pony ride kind of way. In a this is how you survive kind of way. A 6-year-old Mongol child could probably ride better than most medieval knights in Europe. Which is slightly embarrassing for the knights. And very useful for the Mongols. Breakfast is not exactly what modern people would call luxurious. There is dried meat. Very dried meat. So dry it could probably survive another century. And then there is arag, fermented mare's milk. If you've never tasted fermented mare's milk, imagine yogurt that decided to become alcohol. It is sour. It is fizzy. And if you drink enough of it, it becomes surprisingly entertaining. The Mongols drink it constantly. Not because it's trendy. But because the steppe doesn't exactly offer coffee shops. By mid-morning the camp begins to move. This is something Mongol life does often. Move. Entire communities pack their homes onto carts pulled by oxen or camels. The round wooden frames of the jars are folded, the felt walls rolled up, the roof rings tied with rope. Within a couple of hours, a village disappears. And a moving caravan replaces it. If you blink, you might miss the fact that hundreds of people lived here just a few hours ago. Nomadic life is efficient like that. You don't build giant stone houses when you plan to leave next week. Meanwhile, somewhere out on the grasslands, a boy rides alone. His name is Temujin. You might know him by another name later. But right now he is just a thin, determined kid with messy hair and a stubborn horse. Temujin's early life is not easy. His father, a tribal leader, was poisoned by rivals when Temujin was still young. After that, his family was abandoned by their own tribe. Which is the medieval steppe equivalent of being thrown into the wilderness with no wallet, no phone, and several wolves. They survived by trapping fish, gathering roots, and occasionally arguing with each other about whose fault everything was. Temujin learned something important during those years. Not just how to survive, but how unreliable tribal loyalty could be. That lesson would shape the empire he eventually builds. Because when Temujin grows up, he starts doing something unusual. Instead of organizing his followers by tribe, he organizes them by loyalty and skill. A shepherd might command warriors. A noble might end up following someone who used to herd goats. For the rigid tribal politics of the steppe, this is basically revolutionary. And people notice. Some tribes join him. Some tribes decide they absolutely hate him. Which leads to the next big Mongol tradition. War. Now, Mongol warfare is often imagined as endless screaming hordes galloping wildly across the plains. But the reality is actually very organized. Mongol armies use a strict decimal system. 10 soldiers form a unit. 10 of those make 100. 10 hundreds make 1,000. And 10,000s form a tuman, the basic large Mongol army unit. It's simple, clear, and incredibly efficient. Meanwhile in medieval Europe, armies are sometimes organized by things like, who showed up today. So you can imagine which system tends to work better. The most famous Mongol weapon is the composite bow. This bow is not large. But it is powerful. It is made from layers of wood, horn, and sinew glued together with a type of adhesive that medieval craftsmen guarded like treasure. The result is a bow that can fire arrows with terrifying speed and accuracy, even from horseback. And the Mongols practice constantly. They can shoot while galloping. They can shoot behind them while riding away. They can shoot at targets most people can barely see. Imagine trying to fight someone who can hit you from 50 meters away while riding a horse at full speed. And then imagine there are 10,000 of them.